Hey guys, tonight let's do that thing where you dim the lights, maybe put your phone face down, and pretend you're definitely going to sleep after this. No pressure, just history. Soft, slow history. Tonight, we're easing into a story that starts in a place most ancient empires barely noticed, a hot, sandy stretch of Arabia. Not Rome, not Persia, not even somewhere with decent plumbing. And yet, somehow, this place is about to quietly flip the world upside down in about a century. No rush, no dramatic trumpet blasts, just a steady, slightly bewildering transformation that historians are still trying to explain without sounding impressed. So let's settle in, because this isn't the story of instant conquest or cinematic battles. It's a story of ideas, of people who absolutely did not expect to matter, suddenly mattering a lot. We begin, as so many world-changing stories do, with a guy who didn't want to be famous. In the early 600s, Arabia was not exactly the center of global ambition. It was more like a cultural waiting room. Trade routes passed through, empires politely ignored it, and local tribes handled politics the old-fashioned way, by arguing over honor, bloodlines, and who insulted whose camel. Mecca, though, was doing okay. It had the Kaaba, a cube-shaped sanctuary that everyone agreed was important, even if no one agreed why anymore. Inside it were idols, lots of them, a whole pantheon, really. If polytheism were a hobby, Mecca was fully committed. Enter Muhammad ibn Abdullah, born around 570 CE, orphaned early, because of course he was, raised by relatives, worked as a merchant, known for being calm, trustworthy, not flashy, which is historically dangerous because calm people tend to change things. By his 40s, Muhammad had developed a habit of retreating to a cave outside Mecca, not for drama, not to brood, just quiet reflection, which historically is also dangerous. And then, one night, something happened, the kind of thing that permanently disrupts history. According to Islamic tradition, he received revelation, not vague inspiration, not a poetic vibe, a direct message. There is one God, he is absolute, merciful, and you, Muhammad, are now responsible for telling everyone. No pressure. Muhammad did not immediately announce this, which is relatable. Instead, he told a few people he trusted, his wife Khadijah, close friends. Gradually, the message spread. And the message was inconvenient. One God, no idols, no tribal gods, no spiritual hierarchy based on bloodline. Everyone equal before God. This was not popular with Mecca's elite, because their entire economy revolved around idols and pilgrimage tourism, and they liked it that way. So they mocked him, ignored him, then threatened him, then escalated, because escalation is a human specialty. Followers were harassed, some were tortured. Muhammad himself was ridiculed publicly. Poets wrote insults, which at the time was serious business. Still, the message continued, slowly, quietly. No armies, no palace, just words. Eventually, Mecca became too hostile, and so came the Hijra, the migration to Medina in 622 CE. This moment is so important that the Islamic calendar starts here, not with birth, not with revelation, but with community. Medina welcomed Muhammad not as a mystic, but as a mediator, a leader, someone to resolve disputes between feuding tribes who were exhausted by constant conflict. And here's where something subtle but massive happens. Islam stops being only a message and starts becoming a society. In Medina, Muhammad didn't build a palace. He built a mosque, which doubled as a meeting hall, court, and community center. Efficient, very on-brand. Laws began to take shape. Rules about charity, justice, family, trade, even warfare, but we'll stay gentle here. What mattered most was that loyalty shifted, not to tribe, not to bloodline, but to belief. That idea alone was revolutionary. People who had spent generations fighting suddenly saw themselves as part of one ummah, one community. And this unity,
calm and deliberate, turned out to be powerful. Over the next few years, relations with Mecca remained tense. There were conflicts, negotiations, long stretches of uncertainty. And then, almost anticlimactically, Mecca surrendered. The city was taken largely without bloodshed. The idols were removed from the Kaaba, and Muhammad forgave many of his former enemies, which confused everyone. He didn't claim kingship, didn't crown himself, didn't build monuments. 2 years later, in 632 CE, he died. And here's where history usually panics, because charismatic founders are great, but what happens after they're gone? Usually, chaos. The early Muslim community had to answer a question immediately. Who leads now? The answer wasn't obvious, and, gently put, people had opinions. Eventually, Abu Bakr became the first caliph. Not a prophet, not divine, just a leader tasked with maintaining unity. And unity was fragile. Some tribes tried to leave Islam. Others claimed new prophets, because of course they did. Abu Bakr responded firmly, calmly, and decisively. Then came Umar ibn al-Khattab, and here's where the tempo changes. Umar was intense, organized, practical, not especially sentimental. Under his leadership, the Islamic State expanded rapidly, not as a random rampage, but as a structured system. And this expansion coincided with something very convenient. The two major superpowers of the region, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire, were exhausted. Decades of war had drained their armies and treasuries. They were tired, overextended, and not expecting much trouble from Arabia, which historically is a mistake. Muslim armies moved into Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Persia. But here's the strange part. They didn't force mass conversions. They didn't erase local cultures. They didn't burn everything down and start over. Instead, they taxed non-Muslims, protected their religious practices, and left administrative systems largely intact. This was unexpected. For many local populations, Muslim rule was actually less oppressive than what came before. Lower taxes, less corruption, more predictable governance. So people didn't revolt, they adapted. And slowly, very slowly, many converted. Not at sword point, but over generations. By the time Umar was assassinated in 644 CE, the Islamic world stretched across vast territory. Then came Uthman, and then Ali, and then civil war. Because no world-changing movement gets out of that stage. Leadership disputes, political tension, grief, fractures. And yet, despite internal conflict, the civilization kept expanding. By the early 700s, less than a century after Muhammad's death, Islam had spread from Spain in the west to the edges of India in the east. Pause on that for a moment. Rome took centuries. Christianity took centuries. Islam did this in one lifetime's worth of historical memory, and not by erasing the past, but absorbing it. Greek philosophy, Persian administration, Roman law, Indian mathematics, all translated, preserved, expanded. Arabic became the language of scholarship. Mosques became centers of learning, and cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and later Cordoba became intellectual hubs. This wasn't accidental. Islam placed a high value on knowledge, on reading, on thinking. The first word revealed, after all, was read, which is a bold opening line for a civilization. By the end of the first 100 years, Islam was no longer just a religion. It was a framework for living, for governing, for thinking. It connected continents, standardized trade, encouraged literacy, and reshaped ideas about law, ethics, and society. All without a single emperor claiming divine status. All without marble statues or golden crowns. Just text, community, and a very persistent idea that the world could be ordered differently. And that idea quietly changed everything. Let's rest here for a moment, because next we'll drift into the dynasties, the caliphs who loved power a little too much, the palaces, the bureaucracy, the human messiness that always follows success. But for now, breathe. The desert is quiet, the world is still turning, and history is only just getting comfortable.
All right. If you're still with me, congratulations. Your phone is probably warm. Your eyes are maybe half closed. Perfect. Let's just drift back in. When we last left off, Islam had done something deeply inconvenient for the existing world order. It had expanded, quickly, calmly, and with far less chaos than anyone was emotionally prepared for. But now comes the phase that every successful movement eventually stumbles into: paperwork, palaces, and people who decide they deserve nicer chairs than everyone else. Welcome to the Umayyad period. After the early caliphs, those close companions of Muhammad, the leadership of the Islamic world slowly shifted from something like collective responsibility to something much more familiar: dynasty, because of course it did. The Umayyads, based in Damascus, ruled from roughly 661 to 750 CE. They were efficient, organized, and very aware that running an empire requires more than good intentions and memorized scripture. They standardized coinage, built roads, expanded bureaucracy, and made Arabic the official administrative language. Which sounds boring, but boring things tend to last. This move alone quietly reshaped the region. Suddenly, contracts, laws, and records were in Arabic. If you wanted upward mobility, you learned the language, and once you learned the language, conversion didn't feel so distant. Still, the Umayyads were not exactly humble desert mystics. They built palaces, they enjoyed luxury, they preferred their own family members in positions of power, which annoyed a lot of people who remembered when leadership was supposed to be about piety, not upholstery. But here's the strange thing. Even with all this imperial comfort setting, the Islamic world kept absorbing cultures rather than flattening them. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians all remained. They paid taxes, they kept their faiths, they participated in trade and administration, and for many, life was stable, which is underrated. Let's float west for a moment. Across North Africa, Muslim rule spread rapidly, not in a dramatic blitz, but in a steady, negotiated expansion. Local elites often kept their positions, cities kept their customs, and then in 711 CE, Muslim forces crossed into Iberia, Spain, or Al-Andalus as it would become known. Within a few years, much of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. The Visigothic kingdom collapsed with surprising ease. Internal feuds helped. They always do. What emerged instead was something unexpectedly luminous. Cities like Córdoba became centers of learning, culture, and, importantly, indoor lighting, which medieval Europe was still very emotionally distant from. Libraries flourished, universities formed, medicine advanced, philosophy was debated. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived, imperfectly but productively, side by side. This was not paradise, but it was functional, and in history, functional is rare. Now let's drift east, into Persia. The fall of the Sasanian Empire was one of the most dramatic shifts of the era. An ancient civilization, gone. But Persian culture didn't disappear. It seeped in. Persian administrators helped run the empire. Persian literature influenced Islamic thought. Persian ideas of kingship, ceremony, and governance quietly reshaped caliphal authority. This fusion mattered. Islam wasn't replacing civilizations, it was layering itself on top of them, which made it adaptable, durable, and occasionally confusing. By the mid-700s, the Umayyads had done something remarkable. They created a connected world stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia, unified not by ethnicity, but by law, language, and belief. But they also made enemies, lots of them.
Non-Arab Muslims felt sidelined. Religious scholars disliked the dynasty's worldly habits. Old tribal rivalries never fully disappeared, and eventually the Umayyad fell. Not with a gentle sigh, but with a revolution. Enter the Abbasids. The Abbasids came to power in 750 CE. They moved the capital eastward, eventually founding Baghdad. And Baghdad was different. This wasn't just a political center, it was an intellectual one. The Abbasids leaned into learning aggressively. Greek texts were translated into Arabic. Indian mathematics was studied. Persian literature was embraced. The famous House of Wisdom wasn't a myth, it was a translation movement on a civilizational scale. And this mattered deeply, because while much of Europe was dealing with fragmented kingdoms and very cold castles, the Islamic world was debating Aristotle, refining algebra, and writing medical encyclopedias, quietly, methodically, without fireworks. But let's not romanticize too much. The Abbasids also enjoyed luxury, a lot of it. Caliphs lived in sprawling palaces, court politics became elaborate, power struggles intensified. Some caliphs were deeply pious scholars, others were less so. Poetry, wine, philosophy, theology all coexisted, sometimes uncomfortably. And yet, despite internal contradictions, the system worked. Trade flowed from China to the Mediterranean. Ideas moved freely. Scholars traveled. Books multiplied. Paper technology arrived from China, and suddenly knowledge became cheaper, which is always dangerous, in the best way. By the end of the first 100 years after Muhammad's death, the transformation was undeniable. Islam had reshaped law, language, trade, education, governance, not by erasing difference, but by connecting it. This was a civilization built less on bloodline supremacy and more on participation. You didn't have to be Arab to matter. You didn't have to be noble to contribute. You just had to engage, which quietly rewired how societies thought about belonging. As we gently drift onward, we'll start noticing something else. How this world, so interconnected, so confident in reason and faith, would eventually face fragmentation. Dynasties splitting, authority decentralizing, regional powers rising, all very human. But for now, let's stay in this moment. Baghdad is glowing softly by lamplight. Scholars murmur over manuscripts. Traders rest after long journeys. And the world, for a brief historical moment, feels intellectually awake. Take a breath. In the next part, we'll wander through the personal lives of caliphs, scholars, and rulers who shaped this world, sometimes wisely, sometimes dramatically, and sometimes just because they really liked being in charge. No rush. History has time.
All right. Still here? Excellent. At this point, your breathing should be slow, your thoughts pleasantly unfocused, and history should feel less like a subject and more like a very long, calm train ride with no announcements. So let's just keep rolling. By the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the Islamic world had entered what historians later labeled, very confidently, the Golden Age, which is flattering and also misleading, because Golden Ages are rarely shiny while you're living in them. They're mostly paperwork, personalities, and people arguing about footnotes. But from a distance, yes, very golden. Baghdad, under the Abbasids, became the beating heart of this world. It was deliberately built, circular, symbolic, very proud of itself. At the center sat the caliph's palace. Radiating outward were markets, mosques, libraries, workshops, and homes. And people came from everywhere. Persians, Arabs, Central Asians, Christians, Jews, former Buddhists, Zoroastrians, everyone with a book, an idea, or a skill. This wasn't accidental tolerance, it was strategic. The Abbasids realized that knowledge was power, and power was easier to maintain when smart people felt included. So they funded scholars, paid translators, sponsored debates. Imagine a government paying people to argue about metaphysics, calmly, on paper. Truly wild. Greek philosophy arrived in Arabic. Plato, Aristotle, Galen, not worshipped, not rejected outright, but examined. Muslim scholars didn't just copy these texts, they critiqued them, expanded them, argued with them, which annoyed later Europeans who assumed medieval people didn't think critically. They very much did. They just did it quietly, with ink. Al-Khwarizmi formalized algebra, which, despite the name, was not about vibes, it was about structure. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, wrote medical texts that would be used in Europe for centuries. Centuries! Hospitals became organized institutions, not just places to hope you survived. Astronomy advanced, optics advanced, maps improved, and all of this existed alongside theology. There was no assumed conflict between faith and reason. They were seen as parallel tools, which is an important point we'll gently underline and then move past, because we're not here to debate, we're here to relax. But here's the human part. With all this knowledge came opinions, so many opinions. Scholars debated theology intensely. What is free will? What is God's nature? Is the Quran created or eternal? And these weren't abstract arguments, they had political consequences. Some caliphs backed certain schools of thought, others opposed them. At times, scholars were patronized, at other times imprisoned, because intellectual history is rarely calm. It just looks calm from far away. Meanwhile, the empire itself was becoming too large to feel intimate. Provincial governors grew powerful, regional identities strengthened. Egypt felt less like Baghdad. Spain felt like its own world. Persia retained its distinct character, and slowly authority decentralized. This wasn't collapse, not yet. It was more like stretching. In Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, things took a unique turn. The Umayyads, yes, those Umayyads, had survived there. One prince escaped the Abbasid purge and established a rival caliphate in Cordoba, because history loves callbacks. Cordoba blossomed. Streetlights, public baths, libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes. European visitors reportedly stared at it like someone seeing indoor heating for the first time. And while Christian Europe struggled through political fragmentation, Al-Andalus quietly became one of the most cultured places on the planet. Again, not perfect, but productive. Back east, Baghdad continued to thrive, but something subtle was changing. The caliphs began relying more on soldiers, specifically Turkic soldiers, professional, efficient, loyal to pay, not lineage, which worked until it didn't. Military power slowly separated from spiritual authority. Caliphs became symbolic, generals became decisive. This happens a lot in history. It never ends well, but it does take a while. Despite these shifts, the broader Islamic world remained connected. Trade routes spanned continents, spices, silk, paper, gold, ideas, all moving. A merchant in Cairo could correspond with one in Samarkand. A scholar in Damascus could quote someone in Cordoba. This was globalization, pre-modern, quiet, ink-based. And it mattered, because while borders shifted and dynasties argued, the civilizational foundation held. Law, language, shared intellectual heritage, Islam had become the connective tissue of a vast world. And then, gently, we notice the tone shift. Not disaster, not collapse, just fatigue. Empires age, institutions ossify, innovation slows. And while the Islamic world remained vibrant for centuries more, the early explosive expansion, the first 100 years' energy, was gone. What replaced it was maintenance, administration, tradition, defense. Still impressive, just quieter. But let's pause and zoom out, because it's easy to forget what this civilization had already done. In just a century, Islam united fractured regions, preserved ancient knowledge, encouraged literacy, created legal systems, fostered scientific inquiry, connected continents, all beginning from a place the world barely noticed. No empire had done this so quickly, and few would ever match its intellectual depth. And it all began with a message that asked people to read, reflect, and submit not to power, but to principle, which is oddly calming. As we drift forward, the story becomes more fragmented. Regional dynasties, cultural variations, different expressions of a shared foundation. And eventually, external pressures will arrive, crusaders, Mongols, colonial powers, but that's later, much later. For now, let's stay here, in the lamplight of Baghdad, in the libraries of Cordoba, in the quiet confidence of a world that believes knowledge itself is a form of worship. Breathe in, breathe out. In the next part, we'll gently explore how this civilization interacted with the rest of the world and how its influence quietly shaped places that didn't even realize they were borrowing. No drama, no rush, just history continuing to unfold.
All right, welcome back. If you nodded off for a minute, that's fine. History waited. Let's ease forward. By this point in the story, the Islamic world wasn't just living its own life. It was quietly leaking into everyone else's. Not loudly, not with banners, but through trade, books, medicine, and extremely useful ideas, which is how influence usually works. Europe, during much of this period, was busy elsewhere. Local kings, church politics, castles that were cold for no reason, very committed to feudalism. But Europe was not isolated. It just liked to pretend it was. Muslim lands bordered Christian lands constantly, through Spain, through Sicily, through the eastern Mediterranean. Merchants talked, scholars traveled, captured books changed hands, and slowly concepts crossed borders. Arabic numerals, which are not actually Arabic but came through Arabic scholarship. Decimals, 0. Try running a modern economy without 0. It's emotionally exhausting. Medical texts were translated into Latin. Astronomy tables circulated. Philosophy resurfaced. Aristotle returned to Europe not directly from Greece, but through Muslim scholars who had preserved and expanded his work, which is one of history's quieter ironies. This wasn't a one-way flow. Muslim scholars were also learning from India, from China, from Africa. Papermaking came from China. Navigation techniques evolved through Indian Ocean trade. The Islamic world acted as a bridge, a translator, a curator. And bridges rarely get credit. They're just expected to exist. Meanwhile, within Islamic societies, everyday life continued. Markets bustled, families argued. Children studied the Quran and basic arithmetic. Judges settled disputes. Law, Sharia, was not a single rigid code. It was a living system, interpreted, debated. Different schools of thought emerged. They disagreed politely, mostly, which allowed for flexibility across regions. What worked in Baghdad didn't have to work exactly the same way in Cairo or Cordoba. Unity without uniformity. Again, very practical. But no civilization is immune to stress. By the 10th and 11th centuries, political unity weakened further. The Abbasid caliphs remained, but real power often lay elsewhere. Local dynasties rose. The Fatimids in North Africa, the Seljuks in the east, others everywhere. This fragmentation didn't destroy Islamic civilization, it diversified it. Different styles of art emerged, different architectural traditions, different emphases in scholarship. Islam became less like a single empire and more like a shared cultural language, which is often more durable. And then, gently but unmistakably, came the Crusades. Not suddenly, not all at once, but as a series of military religious campaigns from Europe into the Eastern Mediterranean. We won't dramatize this, that's not the vibe tonight. What matters is the contrast. Europe arrived fragmented, intense, and ideologically charged. The Islamic world, though divided politically, was culturally confident. Cities like Jerusalem changed hands, violence occurred, trauma accumulated. But something else happened too. Contact increased. Europeans encountered cities larger than theirs, medical systems more advanced, libraries fuller. And while they didn't always admit it, they noticed. Back in Europe, change accelerated. Universities formed,
texts circulated, methods improved, and many of these developments had roots, quiet, uncredited roots in Islamic scholarship. Algebra entered classrooms, medicine advanced, navigation improved. This wasn't theft, it was transmission. Civilizations learn from each other, even if they don't like each other. Now, let's pause and reflect gently. The first 100 years of Islam changed the world by building a framework, but the centuries after extended that influence far beyond political borders. Islam shaped how knowledge moved, how law adapted, how science survived, how cultures interacted, even where Muslims never ruled. And that influence lingered long after empires faded, which is the mark of a civilization, not just a conquest. But we're also approaching a turning point, because external pressures will increase, internal divisions will deepen, and eventually the world will change again. Mongol invasions, colonial expansion, industrialization. But that's not tonight. Tonight we stay in the slow centuries, where ideas travel by horse and ship, where books are precious, where learning is still a moral act. Breathe. In the next part, we'll gently explore how Islam reshaped everyday life, family, charity, education, and how those changes echoed across continents. No urgency, no drama, just history, continuing its long, patient walk forward.
All right. Welcome back again. If you've lost track of time, that's ideal. History is doing its job. Let's slow the pace even more now, because while empires rise and scholars argue, most of civilization is built in quieter places. Homes, markets, schools, courtyards where nothing historically dramatic ever happens. And yet, this is where Islam made some of its most lasting changes. One of the earliest shifts Islam introduced wasn't political, it was personal. Daily rhythm. 5 prayers spaced across the day, not rushed, not shouted, just consistent. Time itself became structured around devotion. Work paused, life recalibrated. This wasn't about control, it was about grounding. In a pre-modern world with no clocks on walls and no phones buzzing reminders, prayer anchored time. Morning, noon, afternoon, evening, night. Days felt ordered, predictable, which humans secretly love. Then there was charity. Zakat wasn't optional generosity, it was obligation. A system, calculated, expected. Money flowed, imperfectly but intentionally, from those with surplus to those without. This didn't eliminate poverty, nothing ever does, but it changed the tone. Helping wasn't heroic, it was normal, and that normality mattered. Family life shifted too. Marriage became contractual rather than purely tribal. Women had defined rights to inheritance, consent, and property, radical ideas in the 7th century. Not perfectly applied, never perfectly applied, but written down. And once something is written down, it becomes much harder to ignore. Children were educated early. Memorization mattered, literacy mattered, not just for elites, which slowly raised baseline knowledge across society. Again, quiet change, long-term impact. Education, especially, became central. Mosques doubled as schools. Madrasas formed. Scholars taught law, theology, language, mathematics. And education wasn't just for nobles. If you could sit, listen, and memorize, you belonged, which meant talent could rise from anywhere. A shepherd's son could become a jurist. A merchant's daughter could become a scholar. Social mobility wasn't guaranteed, but it existed, and that alone reshaped societies. Markets also felt the influence. Islamic law regulated trade heavily. Honesty was religious. Contracts mattered. Cheating wasn't just illegal, it was sinful. This created trust, and trust makes commerce easier. Merchants traveled vast distances because they shared legal and moral assumptions. A deal in Cairo felt familiar in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Samarkand. Globalization again, but softer.
Even architecture reflected these values. Mosques were communal spaces, open, accessible. Courtyards encouraged gathering. Fountains encouraged cleanliness. Homes were inward-facing. Privacy mattered. Streets twisted organically, shading pedestrians from the sun. Cities weren't designed to impress outsiders. They were designed to be lived in, which makes them last. Of course, people were still people. They argued, they bent rules, they found loopholes. Some rulers were pious, others were decorative. Wine was officially discouraged, unofficially present. Poetry thrived. Love poems, satire, existential reflection. Islamic civilization was not monolithic or humorless, it was deeply human. And this humanity spread. As Islam moved into Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, it adapted. Local customs blended with Islamic principles. African Islam looked different from Persian Islam. Indonesian Islam felt different from Arab Islam. And that flexibility kept the faith alive. Uniformity was never the goal. Continuity was. By now, centuries after that quiet beginning in Mecca, the world had been reshaped. Not suddenly, not violently, but thoroughly. Islam influenced how people measured time, how they educated children, how they conducted business, how they thought about justice and mercy. Even people who never converted felt its presence. That's influence. As we approach the end of this long drift, it's worth noticing something gentle and important. The first 100 years of Islam didn't succeed because of spectacle. They succeeded because of systems, ideas that worked, practices that made sense, values that scaled. No golden age lasts forever. No civilization stays central, but frameworks endure. And the framework Islam built, spiritual, legal, intellectual, continued shaping the world long after political dominance faded. So, as we rest here, somewhere between past and present, remember this. World-changing moments don't always feel loud. They often feel routine. A prayer, a contract, a book copied by lamplight, a child learning to read. That's how civilizations actually change. Slowly, softly, and almost always while everyone involved is just trying to get through the day. Take a deep breath. History isn't finished. It never is. But for tonight, it's calm enough to sleep.
All right. Still here? Good. This is the part of the story where the lights stay low, the tone stays calm, and the outside world starts knocking a little louder than anyone would prefer. Not crashing in, not yet, just tapping. By now, Islamic civilization had settled into a long, steady rhythm. Cities functioned, institutions worked, scholarship continued, which historically is when interruptions arrive. Let's start gently. From the north and east came people who did not care much for libraries. Steppe warriors, nomads, excellent riders, not big on paperwork. The Seljuks arrived first. Turkic in origin, recently Muslim, and very good at military organization. They didn't overthrow Islamic civilization, they plugged into it. They protected trade routes, defended borders, and slowly took over the practical work of governing. The Abbasid Caliph remained in Baghdad, still respected, still symbolic, but increasingly decorative, which is a polite historical way of saying someone else held the sword. This arrangement worked for a while. Islamic civilization adapted again. Persian administrative culture mixed with Turkic military strength and Arabic religious authority. It sounds messy. It was, but it functioned. And while Europe was still figuring out centralized states, this world was experimenting with hybrid governance models, quietly, imperfectly. Then came the Crusades. Again, we won't linger. What matters isn't the battles, it's the shift. For the first time in centuries, large parts of the Islamic world experienced sustained external pressure from the West. Cities were lost, recaptured, lost again. Jerusalem changed hands. Pilgrims arrived with armor. And yet, life continued. Markets reopened, schools resumed, scholarship did not stop.
This is important because civilizations don't collapse when challenged, they collapse when they stop functioning internally. And Islamic society, for all its fractures, kept functioning. But the real interruption came from the east, and this one did not knock. The Mongols arrived like a weather event, fast, overwhelming, uninterested in negotiation. In 1258, Baghdad fell. The city that symbolized centuries of learning, administration, and cultural confidence was devastated, libraries destroyed, institutions shattered, a psychological rupture that echoed across the Islamic world. This was not just a military defeat, it was emotional. The idea that this civilization was protected by its own coherence broke. And for a moment, just a moment, history held its breath. But here's the part that doesn't always get emphasized. Islamic civilization did not end, it adapted, again. Surviving scholars moved elsewhere, Cairo, Damascus, Central Asia. New centers emerged. The Mongols themselves eventually converted to Islam, which is one of history's quieter reversals. The destroyers became participants. By the late medieval period, Islamic civilization had changed shape, less centralized, more regional. Ottomans rose in Anatolia, Safavids in Persia, Mughals in India. Different languages, different styles, same underlying framework: law, faith, education. The first 100 years built the foundation, the next centuries tested it, and it held. Meanwhile, Europe changed too. Renaissance, Reformation, exploration, often framed as purely internal developments, but many of their tools, navigation, mathematics, medicine, had roots in Islamic scholarship. Again, not loudly acknowledged, just used. By the early modern period, global power balances shifted. Industrialization favored Europe, colonialism followed. Islamic societies faced new pressures: economic, political, psychological. But that's a different chapter. Tonight, we're not racing toward modernity, we're lingering. Because when we look back at that first century, those quiet beginnings in Arabia, it's clear what made the difference. Not empire, not conquest, but coherence. A worldview that connected belief with law, community with ethics, knowledge with worship. That coherence allowed adaptation, and adaptation is survival. So as we gently approach the end of this long walk through history, let's rest in this realization. Civilizations don't last because they're perfect, they last because they're flexible. Islam changed the world in 100 years, not by force alone, but by offering a system people could live inside, and live inside comfortably. Take a breath. The interruptions will keep coming, they always do, but the ideas, those travel more quietly and much farther. In the final part, we'll zoom all the way out, without drama, and reflect on what this transformation actually left behind and why its echoes are still around us now. No conclusions shouted, no lessons underlined, just history settling back into silence.
All right. If you're still awake, you're doing very well. If you're half asleep, even better. Let's drift into the later centuries now, where confidence meets reality, and civilizations are reminded they are, in fact, mortal. Not dramatically, just eventually. In the early 13th century, rumors began circulating. Cities falling, armies appearing suddenly, riders who did not negotiate. The Mongols. They didn't arrive with theology or philosophy or libraries. They arrived with speed. And for a world built on cities, books, and scholars, this was unsettling. When Baghdad fell in 1258, it wasn't just a political loss, it was psychological. A capital that had stood for centuries, gone. Libraries destroyed, institutions shattered. Historians later dramatized this moment heavily, and yes, it was devastating, but it wasn't the end. Because civilizations don't disappear in a single moment, they fragment, they relocate, they adapt. And Islam had already learned how to do that. Centers of learning shifted, Cairo rose, Damascus endured, Istanbul would later emerge. The Ottomans would pick up the thread, blending Islamic law, military organization, and imperial ambition. Different style, same foundation. Meanwhile, Europe was changing too. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, colonial expansion. And many of these movements unknowingly built on knowledge preserved and transmitted by the Islamic world centuries earlier. Irony again. History loves it. By the modern era, political dominance had shifted away from Muslim empires, but cultural influence doesn't vanish when power fades. Islam remained deeply rooted across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Not as an empire, but as a lived tradition. Daily prayers, law, ethics, community. The framework endured. So when we ask, how did Islam change the world in just 100 years, the answer isn't just territory, it's infrastructure. Mental infrastructure, social infrastructure, moral infrastructure. A way of organizing life that proved adaptable across continents and centuries. And that's where we'll gently rest. Not at an ending, history never ends, but at a quiet understanding. That sometimes the most powerful changes don't announce themselves. They settle in. They organize time. They teach people how to live together. And long after empires fade, they're still there, softly, patiently, like history itself. Take a breath. You can sleep now.
All right. This is where things settle. No more empires rising or falling tonight. Just reflection. Because the real story we've been telling isn't about conquest, it's about structure. That first 100 years of Islam created something durable, a worldview that linked belief with action, faith with law, spirituality with learning. It taught societies how to organize time, how to educate, how to trade, how to argue respectfully. Those systems outlived dynasties. They crossed continents. They adapted to cultures wildly different from 7th century Arabia, and they're still here. Modern Islam exists in a very different world. Nations, borders, technology, but many of its core rhythms remain. Prayer, structuring the day, charity as obligation, knowledge as worship. These aren't historical artifacts, they're living habits. And that's the quiet miracle. Islam didn't change the world in just 100 years by being loud. It changed the world by being repeatable, by offering ideas that worked in daily life, that made sense across cultures, that could be taught to children and practiced by adults. That kind of change doesn't fade easily. So as we end this long, slow walk through history, let's return mentally to where we began. A quiet desert, a single message, a community forming around an idea. No empire in sight, just people trying to live meaningfully. And somehow, that was enough. Take a breath. History keeps going, but for tonight, you can rest.